for 7 minutes by Richard Swedberg.
The paper of Professor Lydon is a very, very rich paper, and I would like to start out by describing what I see as its main accomplishments. So, first of all, there is the emphasis on the use of the existence of contract as sufficient and convincing evidence in court that a contract indeed exists. And related to this, the author's reflections about the way that this very fact must have facilitated trade. Now, this is a simple point, but the history of scholarship is full of so-called simple points that everyone seems to miss until someone makes them. Secondly, there is the historical exemplification of this fact from the history of Islam, and related to this, the suggestions that the absence of this attitude to contracts may have helped to block Islam's evolution into a market-oriented agent like, say, some forms of Protestantism. This, it seems to me, represents an interesting and important contribution to the economic history of Islam and the current debate of what is known as Islamic institutional stagnation. It represents a contribution, especially, I should emphasize, since the author has also made primary historical research on this issue, mainly in the private libraries of Saharan Africa that we saw some beautiful pictures of. And finally, the author has made a first attempt to draw our attention to the importance of the paper trade for the development of the modern capitalist or market-oriented economy. Another so-called simple, but again important point. What makes all of these points so interesting from a scholarly perspective can be developed much more fully than I've done here, and deserves to be developed more fully. But given the role that I'm supposed to be a commentator and critic, I will make some critical remarks and comments. So my first question or comment has to do with the fact that in the version of the paper that I read, all the pieces of the puzzle have perhaps not been as integrated into their final form as one may have wished. In brief, what should the main point of the paper be? A contribution to the debate of the Islamic institutional stagnation debate, as the subtitle indicates, a contribution to the literature on transaction costs, or what? Now, my own sense is that the emphasis should be on two facts. First, the paper's contribution to the economic history of Islam, and at the same time, then, to some more general theoretical debate. What the latter should be can be discussed. In my own view, it might be exciting to go beyond the political economy of paper because we live in an economy that is progressively eliminating paper, and instead try to see what it is that paper and, let's say, electronic systems of proof have in common. What counts as proof, why, and what are the economic consequences? This would take the paper a bit out of the debate, why the Islamic countries did not develop a so-called dynamic capitalism like Western Europe and the US, and instead related to current developments, which might be challenging and interesting to do. I also have two questions. One has to do with the fact, according to the author, that the Islamic tradition did not accept paper money and was very slow to accept the Gutenberg press. If this is the case, may not something else be involved than the idea that documentary evidence is to be rejected on the ground that any document can be forged? The second question has to do with the following situation. The author argues, as I just said, through the opening quote in the paper and elsewhere, that what is at heart of the matter is a sense in the Islamic legal tradition that documents can be forged and that contracts were therefore not accepted as full evidence in court. Witnesses were not only needed, they were given higher status as evidence. The author also cites the Quran as stating that contracts are important and should be made in writing. Now, my question here is as follows. What exactly is the important item here? The exact statement of the religious text, or the fact that the religious text in the first hand does have an opinion in this economic matter, and an opinion that it expects to be followed? Let me give a counterexample. I quickly looked through the Christian Bible for what it has to say about contracts. Or to tell the truth, I used the internet to search the Bible. And what I found was no clear statement at all about the need for contracts to be followed or be made, but plenty of minor and insignificant references to contracts plus material on the covenant, which is something different. So my suspicion is as follows. According to the Quran, contracts fall under religious authority. But according to the Bible, they do not necessarily do so, which means that commercial courts in Christian countries were much freer to develop contracts and proofs about their existence as the circumstances demanded. Let me also finally suggest a source, or rather a scholarly tradition, that might be useful to look at in this context. This is the late 19th and early 20th century of the history of commercial law in Germany. The main person here is Levin Goldschmidt, who more or less single-handedly created the discipline of the history of commercial law and whose work should be interesting to consult on this issue. It is still sort of an unsurpassed tradition in my mind. It's really very rich. Now, of course, you will expect this from me by now, one of Levin Goldschmidt's students was Max Weber. And what he has to say on this issue, on the issue at hand, can primarily be found in his Sociology of Law, and I will not talk about the Qadi justice now. I'll step that. Weber, for one thing, traces the history of notaries that Professor Lydon draws attention to. He also actually comments on England's role in the development of documentary evidence in commercial papers, which Professor Lydon writes about towards the end of a paper. But there is some difference between his version and that of Professor Lydon, who pays a lot of attention to a royal decree of 1285. Weber argues that, quote, while the development of documentary evidence was greatly favored in Italian law, even in the early Middle Ages, it remained unknown for a long time in English law, where the decisive legally constituted role was instead played by the seal. That's the difference. Let me also tell you about Weber's Sociology of Law, that it was translated to English in the 1950s by Max Reinstein, a very beautiful legal scholar who was a refugee from Germany. Well, he updated Weber's Sociology of Law, so that's one part of Weber's writings where if you read the footnotes you will find what the contemporary texts are. So it's so he has some evidence adding to this argument about the seal being so important. Now, all in all, and to conclude, it was a real pleasure to read this paper by Professor Lydon, and I hope to see it published very soon.